The album that emerged from Orwell's Rejection was Diamond Dogs, released in 1974, and it depicted a future more grotesque and unsettling than anything in 1984. Bowie created Hunger City, a post-apocalyptic urban nightmare where civilization had collapsed and mutant dog-human hybrids roamed the streets, where cannibalism was survival strategy, where decay and violence had become the organizing principles of existence. The imagery was visceral and disturbing in ways that Orwell's clinical dystopia was not. Where 1984 explored political oppression and thought control, Diamond Dogs wallowed in physical degradation and primal chaos. The songs described a world of fleas the size of rats and rats the size of cats, where the remnants of humanity had devolved into something barely recognizable as human. And the album cover, painted by artist Guy Peelert, showed Bowie himself transformed into a half-dog creature, his lower body that of a greyhound with visible genitalia, the image so shocking that several countries demanded it be censored or modified before the album could be sold. If you want to discover how literary rejection created one of rock's most disturbing masterpieces, subscribe to our channel now. Because Diamond Dogs was born from anger and became something darker than Orwell ever imagined. The Orwell obsession. David Bowie's fascination with George Orwell's 1984 began in the late 1960s, long before the novel's titular year would arrive. He had read the book as a teenager and been struck by its vision of totalitarian control, its exploration of how language could be weaponized to limit thought, and particularly by the character of Big Brother, a figurehead who existed more as symbol than person. These themes resonated with Bowie's own interest in performance and identity, in the ways that public personas could be constructed and manipulated. By 1973, as Ziggy Stardust was being retired, and Bowie was searching for his next major artistic project, the idea of adapting 1984 as a theatrical rock musical seemed perfect. He envisioned himself in multiple roles, perhaps as Winston Smith, the protagonist, perhaps as O'Brien, the torturer, perhaps even as Big Brother himself. The staging would be elaborate and dystopian, combining his glam rock aesthetic with Orwell's dark political vision, creating something that would be both entertainment and warning about the dangers of authoritarianism. Bowie began writing songs based on 1984's themes and scenarios, sketching out how the novel's key moments could be translated into theatrical performance. He contacted Orwell's widow, Sonia Brownell Orwell, and the literary estate's representatives, laying out his vision for the project and requesting permission to adapt the novel. His proposal was serious and detailed, demonstrating that this wasn't a casual commercial exploitation, but a genuine artistic engagement with Orwell's work. But the response from the estate was swift and negative. They had no interest in seeing 1984 transformed into a rock musical, no faith that this medium could handle the novel's serious themes with appropriate gravity, and perhaps most fundamentally, no belief that David Bowie, despite his obvious talent and success, was the right person to interpret Orwell's legacy. The rejection was polite but firm, and it left Bowie devastated. He had invested significant creative energy into the project, had already composed material, had begun conceptualizing the theatrical elements. Being denied permission felt like a judgment, not just on this specific project, but on rock music's legitimacy as an art form capable of engaging with serious literary material. The anger transforms. Rather than abandoning the dystopian musical concept entirely, Bowie made a decision that would prove creatively fertile even as it demonstrated his wounded pride and anger at the rejection. If he couldn't use Orwell's dystopia, he would create his own, and it would be so disturbing and innovative that it would prove the Orwell estate had made a mistake in denying him. The result was Hunger City, the setting for what would become the Diamond Dogs album, and it was in many ways a more visceral and horrifying vision than Orwell's carefully controlled totalitarian state. Where 1984 depicted oppression through surveillance and propaganda, Hunger City showed collapse through mutation and decay. Where Orwell's dystopia was organized and systematic, Bowie's was chaotic and primal. The creative shift from adapting Orwell to inventing his own nightmare allowed Bowie to explore themes and imagery that would have been impossible within the constraints of the novel, and the resulting work bears traces of multiple influences beyond Orwell. William S. Burroughs' cut-up technique and urban decay, Anthony Burgess's violent futurism, even echoes of T.S. Eliot's wasteland imagery. The Hunger City of Diamond Dogs was populated by mutants and survivors, with dog-human hybrids serving as the dominant predator species in this collapsed urban environment. The imagery Bowie created was deliberately grotesque and unsettling. Packs of these creatures hunting through ruined streets, cannibalism as common survival strategy, the remnants of human civilization reduced to tribal violence and base instincts. The songs described a world where size relationships had inverted and become nightmarish, where the normal order had completely collapsed. But underneath the horror imagery, Bowie was exploring some of the same themes that had attracted him to Orwell in the first place. Questions about what happens to humanity when social structures fail, about how quickly civilization can degrade, about whether human nature is fundamentally ordered or chaotic. In some ways, Diamond Dogs was asking what comes after 1984. What happens when even Big Brother's totalitarian control collapses and leaves nothing but primal struggle for survival. Guy Peelert's controversial artwork, the visual representation of Hunger City and Bowie's dystopian vision, came through Belgian artist Guy Peelert, whose painting for the Diamond Dogs cover became one of the most controversial images in rock album history. Peelert, known for his hyper-realistic style and his previous rock and roll portraits, was commissioned to create cover art that would capture the album's themes of mutation and decay. What he delivered exceeded and disturbed expectations. The painting showed David Bowie transformed into a centaur-like creature, his recognizable human upper body emerging from the muscular, elongated lower body of a greyhound. The artistic technique was stunning. Peelert's attention to anatomical detail and his ability to merge human and canine forms created an image that was simultaneously beautiful and repulsive. But it was the anatomical completeness of the dog portion that created the controversy. The painting included visible canine genitalia, rendered with the same hyper-realistic detail as the rest of the image. When RCA Records executives saw the finished artwork, they immediately recognized they had a problem. The image was too striking and iconic to reject entirely, but it was also certain to cause censorship issues in multiple markets. In the United States, some retailers refused to stock albums with the original cover. In the United Kingdom, there was less immediate outcry but quiet pressure from distributors concerned about conservative backlash. Several European and Asian markets demanded modifications before they would allow the album to be sold. The solution was airbrushing. The genital details were removed or obscured in subsequent pressings, creating a censored version that looked awkward and obviously modified to anyone comparing it to the original. This dual existence of censored and uncensored versions only added to the album's notoriety and collectability, with the original uncensored pressing becoming highly sought after by collectors who wanted the complete, uncompromised version of Bowie's artistic vision. The musical content. The Diamond Dogs album itself was a showcase for Bowie's evolving musical ambitions and his willingness to take risks that might alienate his existing audience. Unlike the glam rock accessibility of Ziggy Stardust or Aladdin Sane, Diamond Dogs was darker, more theatrical, and structurally ambitious in ways that anticipated the rock opera format. The title track opened the album with a dystopian scenario setting that immediately established Hunger City's nightmare atmosphere. The song Sweet Thing and its companion candidate formed an extended suite that was nearly 9 minutes long, featuring Bowie's vocals, processed and multi-tracked, to create an unsettling, almost inhuman sound that matched the album's themes of mutation and transformation. The lyrical content throughout was more abstract and imagistic than narrative, painting impressionistic pictures of decay and survival rather than telling straightforward stories. Musically, the album showed Bowie moving away from the guitar-driven glam rock that had characterized his previous work and toward a more textured, theatrical sound. This was partly necessity. Guitarist Mick Ronson, who had been crucial to the Ziggy Stardust sound, was no longer working with Bowie, having been unceremoniously dismissed after the Ziggy retirement. Bowie played most of the guitar parts himself on Diamond Dogs, and while he was competent, he lacked Ronson's virtuosity and distinctive tone. But this limitation pushed Bowie toward more experimental arrangements, using synthesizers and layered production to create atmospheric textures rather than relying on guitar heroics. The result was an album that sounded different from anything else in rock at the time. Too dark and strange to be commercial pop, too theatrical and produced to be conventional rock, existing in its own category that would later be recognized as a prototype for art rock and post-punk aesthetics. He tour spectacle. The Diamond Dogs tour that followed the album's release in 1974 was one of the most ambitious and expensive theatrical productions rock music had ever attempted. Bowie envisioned the concert as a complete multimedia experience that would bring Hunger City to life on stage, and he committed to this vision with a budget and scale that alarmed his management and record label. The stage design featured a massive multi-level set that depicted a ruined cityscape with moving bridges, hydraulic lifts, and a large hand prop that Bowie could be lifted by during certain songs. The lighting was elaborate and theatrical, using techniques borrowed from Broadway rather than typical rock concert design. And Bowie himself performed in multiple costumes and characters throughout the show, treating each concert as a theatrical performance rather than just a musical event. But the ambition of the production created significant problems. The elaborate set was so large and complex that it could only be accommodated in the biggest venues, limiting where the tour could perform. The technical requirements were demanding, with frequent malfunctions and delays causing concerts to start late or be interrupted. And the costs were astronomical, eating into profits and putting financial pressure on the entire operation. By the time the tour reached its midpoint, Bowie was exhausted from the demands of performing in such an elaborate production, night after night, and his cocaine use, which had been recreational, was escalating into something more serious as he used the drug to maintain the energy necessary for these demanding shows. The Diamond Dogs tour represented both the peak of Bowie's theatrical ambitions and the beginning of his descent into the drug addiction that would nearly destroy him over the next 2 years. The critical reception. When Diamond Dogs was released in April 1974, critical reception was decidedly mixed, revealing a tension between Bowie's artistic ambitions and audience expectations. Some critics praised the album's darkness and ambition, recognizing it as a mature artistic statement that showed Bowie wasn't content to simply repeat the successful formulas of his previous work. They appreciated the dystopian world-building, the challenging musical arrangements, and Bowie's willingness to create something genuinely disturbing rather than safely commercial. But many other critics were confused or put off by the album's bleakness and its departure from the accessible glam rock that had made Bowie a star. They found the lyrics too abstract, the music too theatrical and overproduced, the overall effect more exhausting than entertaining. And some critics specifically noted that the album felt like it was trying to be something it wasn't, that without the 1984 framework to provide structure, Bowie's dystopian vision was too diffuse and incoherent to fully succeed as concept album. Commercially, Diamond Dogs performed well, but not spectacularly. It reached number 5 on the UK charts and number 5 in the United States, solid numbers that proved Bowie remained a major commercial force, but also indicated that this darker, stranger material wasn't connecting with audiences as powerfully as Ziggy Stardust had. The controversy over the album cover likely helped sales in some markets while hurting them in others, creating a situation where the album's notoriety was both asset and liability. Over time, critical opinion on Diamond Dogs has evolved considerably. What seemed confusing and excessive in 1974 has been reassessed as prophetic and innovative, with many critics now recognizing the album as a crucial bridge between Bowie's glam period and his later experimental work. The influence of Diamond Dogs can be heard in countless post-punk and industrial bands who found in its urban decay imagery and dystopian themes a template for their own dark visions. The Orwell estate's perspective. While David Bowie never publicly expressed deep bitterness about the Orwell estate's rejection, it's clear the decision shaped not just Diamond Dogs, but his attitude toward artistic collaboration and permission for years afterward. The rejection taught him that his ambitions could be blocked by gatekeepers who didn't see rock music as legitimate art, and this fueled his determination to create work that would force recognition on his own terms rather than seeking validation from literary or theatrical establishments. But from the Orwell estate's perspective, their decision was both principled and pragmatic. Sonia Orwell, George's widow, was fiercely protective of her late husband's legacy and skeptical of attempts to commercialize. Sonia Orwell, George's widow, was fiercely protective of her late husband's legacy and skeptical of attempts to commercialize his work, particularly by translating it into popular entertainment formats that she felt would diminish its serious political message. She had turned down numerous adaptation requests over the years, and Bowie's proposal, however artistically sincere, fell into this category of requests that she believed would trivialize Orwell's warnings about totalitarianism. It's worth noting that the Orwell estate would eventually authorize other adaptations of 1984, including film versions and theatrical productions, but these came years later and were approached with different sensibilities and protections. By the time these adaptations were approved, Orwell's work had achieved such canonical status that its serious intent seemed less vulnerable to being misunderstood or diminished by popular interpretation. But in 1973, when Bowie made his request, the cultural landscape was different. Rock music was still fighting for legitimacy as an art form, and the idea of a glam rock star known for theatrical personas and sexual ambiguity adapting Orwell's dystopian masterpiece seemed to the estate like a mismatch that could damage the novel's reputation. Whether they were right or wrong in this assessment is debatable, but their decision was consistent with their mission to protect Orwell's legacies as they understood it. The lasting influence. Diamond Dogs occupies a unique position in David Bowie's catalog and in rock history more broadly. It's not as universally beloved as Ziggy Stardust, not as critically acclaimed as the Berlin Trilogy, not as commercially successful as Let's Dance. But it represents a crucial moment in Bowie's artistic evolution, the point where he proved he could create ambitious conceptual work without relying on established frameworks or commercial formulas. The album's influence can be traced through decades of subsequent music. The industrial and post-punk movements of the late 1970s and 1980s drew heavily on its urban decay imagery and dystopian themes. The album's theatrical ambitions and multimedia approach to presentation anticipated music video as art form and the integration of visual and sonic elements in rock performance. And its willingness to be genuinely disturbing rather than merely shocking set a precedent for artists who wanted to use rock music to explore dark and challenging subject matter. But perhaps most importantly, Diamond Dogs demonstrated that rejection could be transformed into creative fuel, that artistic disappointment could generate work that exceeded what would have been possible if the original plan had been approved. Bowie's 1984 musical, had it been authorized, would likely have been constrained by the need to remain faithful to Orwell's text, limited in its ability to explore themes and imagery beyond what the novel provided. Diamond Dogs, freed from these constraints by necessity, became something wilder and more personal, a vision that was purely Bowie's rather than an interpretation of someone else's creation. The Orwell estate's rejection forced Bowie to dig deeper into his own imagination, to create his own dystopian mythology rather than borrowing someone else's. And the result, whatever its flaws, was undeniably original in ways that an adaptation could never have been. The final assessment: looking back on Diamond Dogs 50 years after its release, it's clear that both the album and the Orwell rejection that prompted it represent important moments in understanding David Bowie's artistic personality. The rejection revealed his pride and his sensitivity to being dismissed by cultural gatekeepers who didn't take rock seriously as art form. His response, creating an even darker dystopia out of anger and determination to prove himself, showed both his resilience and his tendency to channel negative emotions into creative work. And the result, flawed but fascinating, demonstrated that his ambitions sometimes exceeded his ability to fully realize them, but that the ambition itself was valuable and pushed rock music into new territories. Diamond Dogs was neither commercial failure nor unqualified success. It was something more interesting than either, a transitional work that captured an artist between identities, moving from the glam theatricality of his early 70s, work toward the experimental art rock of his mid to late 70s period, and using dystopian imagery to explore themes of decay and transformation that would prove prescient given his own coming struggles with addiction and identity crisis. The album stands as monument to creative transformation, evidence that artistic disappointment can generate work as valuable as artistic triumph, and proof that David Bowie's genius lay not just in his ability to create iconic characters and catchy songs, but in his willingness to take risks and explore darkness even when doing so alienated audiences and invited censorship. The Orwell estate refused him permission to adapt 1984, and in response, he created Hunger City, populating it with mutant dog humans and depicting a world of cannibalism and decay that was more viscerally disturbing than anything in Orwell's novel. The album cover showed him transformed into a half-dog creature, complete with visible genitalia, an image so shocking it was censored in multiple countries. And the resulting work, whatever its commercial limitations and critical ambiguities, proved that David Bowie could create dystopian visions as powerful as any novelist, that rock music could be vehicle for serious artistic exploration of dark themes, and that rejection from the literary establishment only made him more determined to prove his artistic legitimacy on his own terms. Diamond Dogs was the album Orwell's estate didn't want to exist, and that unwantedness made it essential.